Unearthed from the searing deserts of the Middle East, an ancient text told of hidden treasures. One man believed it was a list of gold and silver plundered from one of the great marvels of the ancient world, the Second Temple of Jerusalem.
It's really absolutely the kind of treasure list you would expect to find in a fiction book about a treasure.
If the text was true, it promised the greatest riches in history.
The treasure described from the Copper Scroll must have been temple treasure.
But the Copper Dead Sea Scroll has baffled experts and treasure hunters alike. Some said it was fake.
Is the treasure real, or is it a fabulous kind of fairy story?
The British scholar John Allegro was determined to get to the truth. It was a quest that would cost him nearly everything.
He was in the wilderness, literally in the wilderness.
But nothing would stop him in his search.
John Allegro was always up for an adventure.
That adventure would change his life forever. This is the story of John Allegro's quest to unravel the mysteries of the Copper Dead Sea Scroll. The story of the Copper Dead Sea Scroll began with a chance discovery on the shores of the Dead Sea in what was then Jordan in 1947. A young Bedouin shepherd, looking for his goat among the high cliffs, had come across a cave. In the dark void, he discovered tall earthenware jars containing rolls of parchment wrapped in cloth. These were the first of the fabled Dead Sea Scrolls, dating back almost to the time of Christ, the oldest biblical texts ever found. So precious, they were priceless.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are texts written in Hebrew, Aramaic, a few in Greek, from the time of Jesus. They contain copies of books of the Bible, which are 1,000 years earlier than any copy we had before. They fill in a gap in our knowledge, and they enable us to discover the roots of both Christianity and Judaism. They are fantastically important.
The Bedouin were quick to realize the value of their find, and a frenzy of scroll hunting began.
The number of items that came out of caves was enormous, maybe 87,000 different fragments, representing about 940 different individual scrolls.
In Jerusalem, scholars were desperate to preserve the fragments, so they bought the scrolls from eager Bedouin, selling the precious manuscript parchment at high prices.
With the Dead Sea Scrolls, we've suddenly got an enormous quantity of Hebrew and Aramaic literature from the time of Jesus.
The Dead Sea Scroll fragments offered a tantalizing glimpse dating back some 2,000 years. But translating the ancient texts needed a crack team of scholars. In charge of the mission was a Catholic organization, the French École Biblique, run by its most senior priest, Father Roland de Vaux. He put out an urgent call to the world's finest biblical scholars. At the University of Oxford, the request was put to a talented PhD student, John Allegro. He was no bookish academic. He was a man who had once faced the worst of human nature. Allegro had left school at 16 and joined the British Navy, where he served as an officer during the Second World War. After the conflict, he immersed himself in history, studying the original languages of the Bible, Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic.
been one of the top students both at undergraduate and at master's degree level in Manchester, and had gone to Oxford to study for his doctorate.
When the call came from Davos, Allegro couldn't pass up the chance to study the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were true biblical mysteries he could unravel.
What fascinated him mainly was the sense that these tiny scraps of ancient material had last been handled by men scribbling down what they believed. It was the link, the personal link over nearly 2,000 years of the people who wrote them that brought the whole thing to life for him.
In 1953, he flew to Israel, a journey that would change his life. Allegro knew he and his colleagues were working on one of the most important discoveries of the millennium. But one scroll in particular caught Allegro's eye. Unlike all the others, it was not made of papyrus.
The copper scroll is made of very well refined copper.
This strange copper scroll was discovered in 1952 in a cave located along a small area on the shores of the Dead Sea, known as Qumran. The cave's roof had collapsed, but amongst the rubble at the back, the copper scroll had been found in two pieces. It was inscribed on the inside with an ancient script. Everything about it was a puzzle.
Why was this text inscribed on copper in the first place? Copper, which is extremely refined. It's nearly 100% pure copper.
The technology of making it was not really known widely in that period. And there are serious questions as to how they could actually be able to do it.
Yet while the actual copper seemed advanced, the writing on the scroll was primitive.
It seems to be the case that the Hebrew letters are rather poorly formed. It's quite difficult to read.
However, the few words Allegro could make out stunned him.
He looked at the outside, read it from the outside and said, "That's treasure list."
Allegro couldn't believe his eyes. It seemed he was looking at the answer to one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. In AD 70, the Romans sacked Jerusalem and ransacked the Second Temple. The temple was the holiest place in the Jewish faith. Built on the site of the fabled Temple of Solomon, it was filled with vast treasures accumulated over centuries.
Some of the treasure is gold and silver. Some of it is pottery and other artifacts, the possessions of the high priest.
The precious items that were in the temple at Jerusalem would have been of enormous value, huge amounts.
The Romans looted, plundered, and destroyed it. Some of what they stole can be seen to this day, depicted on the triumphal arch of Titus in Rome.
You can see a huge menorah, which is the seven-branched candlestick that would have been standing in front of the ark. There were trumpets, there were other chests of, obviously, things taken by the Romans back to Rome.
Folklore says the gold and silver was used to pay for the building of the Colosseum. But some believe that the Romans didn't steal all the treasure, that part of it was hidden away by the temple priests. Could Allegro be looking at a 2,000-year-old treasure map that might lead him to one of the greatest discoveries of all time? But frustratingly, he couldn't unravel the scroll. It seemed that 2,000 years of corrosion ensured its secrets would remain secure.
When it was discovered, the copper had become completely oxidized, that is, extremely brittle. So scholars recognized immediately that should they try to open it by unrolling it, it would simply disintegrate.
All sorts of solutions were proposed to open the copper scroll.
A number of really quite ridiculous suggestions were put forward. One, for instance, was that you could reduce the copper in hydrogen, but the whole thing would have just disintegrated and you'd have been left with nothing.
That turned out to be one of the more sensible ideas.
Another absurd attempt was the idea that you could use electrolysis to reduce the copper back from its oxidized state into its metallic state. Absolute metallurgically nonsense.
Numerous methods were considered, but all were rejected. There seemed to be no way of retrieving the scroll's tantalizing secrets. But Allegro refused to be beaten, and he believed he had the answer.
Allegro was the kind of character that wouldn't just say, yes, it'd be a nice idea if we could open it, wouldn't it? He very definitely would say, well, how are we going to open it? Let's do it.
He was now lecturing at Manchester University, which boasted one of the finest engineering departments in the world. The challenge would be a golden opportunity for them. But their response took him by surprise.
Allegro's head of department in Manchester was very determined that the reputation of the University of Manchester should not be put at risk by something going disastrously wrong with this scroll.
Refused by his own university, he turned to the nearby Manchester Institute of Technology. The head of department, Professor H. Wright Baker, embraced the opportunity and proposed a radical solution.
Professor H. Wright Baker was one of the top mechanical engineers, certainly in England and probably in the world. He came up with something that no one had actually applied before, as far as I know, to heavily corroded materials.
Baker's plan was to coat the scroll with strong epoxy resin to stop it disintegrating. Then he would cut through the top layer of the metal scroll, slicing it from one end to the other, cutting away a single section of scroll at a time.
He had a little circular blade which would cut just 1 millimeter, straight line.
After each cut, he'd rotate the scroll to cut and peel away another section.
The trick also, of course, was to try to cut in places where there wasn't any writing.
He began the job in the utmost secrecy. Baker was so nervous about making the first slice and destroying the precious scroll that he went ahead without even telling Allegro.
Wright Baker wouldn't let anybody except himself witness the first cut, just in case something terrible went wrong.
He would, I think, have been absolutely scared that he was going to be the one responsible for destroying the copper scroll.
On October the 1st, 1955, he made the first cut. It took just 10 minutes. In the following days, Baker made the remaining slices.
In the cutting open of the scroll, only one letter of Hebrew was actually lost. This is quite remarkable. Wright Baker did as fine a job as anybody in the world could have done.
And so Allegro became the first man to see the scroll's ancient text, revealed for the first time in almost 2 millennia.
To see the inside of this scroll revealed to the air the first time for nearly 2,000 years was exciting, astonishing.
He immediately set to work, decoding it.
Deciphering the copper scroll was extremely difficult. There were terms that people had never seen before.
And soon, he found a further mystery. The script had been written by several different people.
It seemed that the scribe, or in fact scribes, because I think they found at least 3, if not 4, different hands been at it, could possibly not have really understood what they were copying.
Allegro reasoned that using several scribes, each writing just a small section, would be the best way to keep the treasure secret, as none of them could learn the full story of where it was hidden.
It seemed they were probably copying off some parchment scroll, some writing, but had just been told to put it down, engrave it on this sheet of metal without knowing what it was about.
As he translated the copper scroll, Allegro began to realize that it identified several different locations in Judea. Why? What was their significance?
He thought he recognised from the topography of the Qumran area references within the copper scroll to places like the Great Wadi and a fissure in the rock which had been caused by an earthquake which was well attested in, I think, 31 BC. Flights of steps, tunnels, it all seemed to make sense from what he knew of the archaeological sites around Qumran.
But critically, the more Allegro studied the scroll, the more certain he became that there was only one place the riches it described could have come from.
The treasure described in the copper scroll must have been temple treasure. He couldn't think where else would have had such a wealth of gold coins, tithe vessels, and gold bars, silver bars, precious metals, precious stones.
Because the treasure was so precious, Allegro believed that whoever had hidden it had created an inventory which had been scribed onto extremely pure copper, soft enough to roll.
It was not normal to be engraving on copper at that period in history, Second Temple period. There wasn't copper of that purity available to actually do the engraving, and the fabrication techniques they were using were quite unique. It's a one-off.
Unlike papyrus or parchment, the scroll was made to last, possibly for hundreds of years, awaiting a time when it was safe to recover the treasure. Allegro now put 2 and 2 together. If the stories were true that the temple priests had managed to hide some of the treasure, then the locations he had translated had to be a list of the places it had been hidden. For safekeeping, it must have been spread out.
Once he'd initially translated the first few parts of it, became a real obsession for John.
He realized this was telling you exactly where the treasure was, and if you could find the place, you should be able to find the treasure.
The scroll's text was written in columns. Each listed a series of locations with the precise quantities and weights of the treasure to be found within. In the first column, Allegro read 40 cubits under the steps, entering to the east, a money chest and its contents of a weight of 17 talents. And then, in the tomb of the queen, buried at 12 cubits, 9 talents.
It's really absolutely the kind of treasure list that you would expect to find in a fiction book about a treasure. There it is, you go, dig, 5 paces to the left, down you go, 5 meters, and boom, boom, there it is. So it really is absolutely the perfect treasure list.
Allegro sent his translation to Father Roland de Vaux, the man in charge of the Dead Sea Scrolls project.
He waited for the telegram coming back saying, "This is absolutely great, fantastic, you've done a wonderful job. We're having a press conference tomorrow. We'll tell them all about this treasure. How exciting."
But the answer was not at all what he expected.
The reaction from Roland Deveau was, don't tell anyone. If it's treasure, we don't want anyone to know about it. Keep it completely under your hat.
The fact was that Deveau simply didn't believe the treasures described by the copper scroll were real. Nor did his most trusted expert, Father Joseph Milik.
Deveau certainly was sceptical about the reality of the treasure, and he'd appointed Joseph Milik to be the official editor of the Copper Scroll.
Milik, his first reaction was that the scroll was a work of fiction and of imagination and was not to be taken seriously.
Unlike Allegro, Milik and Deveau felt that the sheer amounts of gold described in the scroll couldn't possibly be genuine.
It was the gold and the silver that was most astonishing because of the apparent quantities it was in.
The units of weight that they were using was a talent, which is about 35 kilograms, 72 pounds, which was a huge weight. They were coming up with totals of 65 tons of silver and 25 tons of gold.
If the scroll weights were correct, it listed a quarter of all the known gold in the world at the time and all of the known silver. It made no sense, though Allegro thought he had an answer.
Allegro was obviously stumped by the huge weights, and he did actually suggest that the talent, that the weight unit they were using might well be 1/60th of the biblical talent, and that would have given much more reasonable amounts of treasure.
Deveau and Milik had another problem. All the other Dead Sea Scrolls were written on parchment. Why was this the only one engraved in copper? However, Allegro argued that this just added to the scroll's credibility.
John Allegro was convinced that the treasure was real because the scroll was made of copper. It wasn't parchment or papyrus. Who would be writing such a fairy tale on copper?
But was it just that? A 2,000-year-old fairy tale? Deveau and Milik's doubts threw the whole credibility of both the scroll and Allegro into question.
This was his baby. He'd gone to all the trouble to get it open, and now he was not only being denied any of the spoils of his triumph, he was kind of being pushed aside, put out of the picture. He obviously resented it. Must have done.
Despite their reservations, the École Biblique did agree to unravel the full text of the scroll. So in 1956, the second, larger section was sent to H. Wright Baker's laboratory. Once opened, Allegro translated the text and sent it to Jerusalem as before. This time, Deveau didn't even believe he deserved a rejection letter. Allegro heard nothing from him at all.
Suddenly, he found he was getting a very chilly reception indeed. He gathered that everything had changed. In fact, everything had been poisoned for him in Jerusalem.
Convinced it was a fake, Deveau refused to let Allegro publish anything about the Copper Scroll.
He was regarded as somebody who couldn't be trusted to keep quiet, that wanted to go out and tell everybody what he was finding in the scrolls.
Allegro protested, demanding to be heard. The reaction from Devoe was swift and decisive. Allegro was ostracized.
Wright Baker had been told he wasn't to be trusted, therefore he wasn't even allowed in the lab or in the lectures. He was threatened with not having his contract renewed, which would mean losing his job.
Relations were then extremely strained. They virtually condemned his career to the wilderness. His career went downhill, his health went downhill, and psychologically he was really, really damaged. It's almost as if they were saying your work has been useless.
Allegro returned to his base at Manchester University. There he waited patiently for years to be allowed to publish his own account of the Copper Dead Sea Scroll. Then in 1959, out of the blue, Devoe's lead scholar, Father Joseph Milik, published his official translation of the scroll.
They said it was a collection of fabulous treasure, so fabulous that it could only be fictional. End of story. And he knew perfectly well that wasn't so. He couldn't believe that they really, really believed that.
He was very upset, particularly because he didn't agree with a lot of the wording of Milik's translation.
It was now a matter of public record. The scroll to which he had dedicated so much of his professional life was a fake. Allegro was outraged.
Allegro had played the game up to that time. He hadn't published anything before Milik had had a chance to put his ideas first.
He was bursting to tell everybody about this. He'd gone to so much trouble to get it deciphered. He had been very patient. He had waited. I think he had any amount of frustration just built up. And he couldn't wait any longer, so he published.
So against Devoe's orders, he wrote his own account. News of the treasure was an instant hit.
The book sold very well and very widely. It stirred the public imagination with the Dead Sea Scrolls once again.
And Allegro didn't just publish a book. He was going to mount an expedition. He would go out into the desert to prove the scroll was real and find the treasure himself.
He was sure of his readings of the scroll, that it was real and factual and not fiction.
All he needed was backers.
He could not rely on his colleagues in Jerusalem. He could not rely on the Jordanian Department of Antiquities. He could not rely on the University of Manchester. It was down to him.
So Allegro cranked up his publicity machine, seeking backers from the press and public. The Daily Mail newspaper stepped up and part-sponsored his expedition. It even sent its star correspondent, Ralph Izzard, to cover the story. With millions of readers now following his every move, the pressure began to mount. Allegro now had to find the fabled treasure.
I'm sure that Allegro had mixed feelings about the presence of the Daily Mail. On the one hand, he must have loved the idea that there was going to be this kind of coverage. On the other hand, I think he should have felt under pressure to find something really exciting because it was in the glare of publicity.
The pressure was all the greater because he now had much of the Jordanian army at his disposal, courtesy of his second sponsor, King Hussein of Jordan.
King Hussein recognized the huge significance of the Dead Sea Scroll material.
The king personally supported Allegro's quest and mobilized his forces on the ground.
King Hussein gave help with making the Royal Jordanian Army landing craft and overland vehicles, and also helicopter support available, which was extremely useful in ferrying supplies out to the camps.
Allegro recruited a band of skilled but amateur enthusiasts. Archaeologists, architects, surveyors, technicians, and a cameraman to photograph the terrain described by the copper scroll. With the world watching, they set off to make camp in the Jordanian desert. Allegro's first destination, the ancient ruin of Khirbet Mird in the Vale of Achor, known 2,000 years ago as Hyrcania. It was a fortress that Allegro believed was once the palace of King Herod of Judea when the scroll was made. Allegro's translation told him that 40 cubits, about 18 meters, under some steps, entering to the east, lay a money chest, its contents weighing 17 talents, nearly 2 kilos. And incredibly, they found something. In the rock face, the team discovered a shaft, a flight of stone stairs that led to an underground, vaulted room. The location, as described in the copper scroll, existed. It was real. But vandals had wrecked the site. Marble columns and mosaic tiles had been hacked to pieces. And any treasure that had been hidden there had vanished. And then it got even worse. When Allegro and his team went back to camp to lick their wounds, their disappointment was quickly swept away by terror. A powerful storm hit Allegro's camp. It flattened their tents, wrecked their stores, and they lost all their precious water. There was a real chance they could die in the desert. But luckily, Allegro's friend, King Hussein, had been keeping a close eye on the expedition.
In the morning when the storm had died down, they found the Royal Jordanian Army trucks on their way, bringing fresh water supplies, fresh equipment, and helping to get them established again and peg them down a bit more firmly on the rock for the next time.
Disaster averted, Allegro's next stop was Khirbet Qumran, an ancient settlement about a mile inland from the northeast shore of the Dead Sea.
The copper scroll does mention as one of the hiding places of treasure a place called Sakaka. And Sakaka is quite possibly the name of Qumran itself. And many of the places mentioned in the copper scroll do seem to point to the Qumran area.
Khirbet Qumran had been home to the Essene Jewish sect, who'd written and hidden the Dead Sea Scrolls in the local caves. If the scrolls had survived untouched for 2 millennia, perhaps the treasure was untouched too. In fact, coins had been found in the area only a few years before.
A hoard of silver shekels had been discovered. And this had led some people to think that maybe the copper scroll described the rest of the Essene treasure.
3 juglets of silver coins which seem to be referred to within the copper scroll. And if the Romans or the Bedouin or anybody else who looted the place had happened to miss these 3 juglets of silver coins, who knows what else they might have missed.
Allegro's team swept the site with metal detectors. The occasional ping of the machines raised their hopes. But in fact, the sensors were being triggered by the natural magnetism of the rocks. By now, press from around the world were following Allegro's treasure hunt. They needed a story.
They had expected to have to fight his way through a throng of journalists every time he stepped outside. They were after pictures of him finding treasure.
Allegro then searched a concealed cave, high in the cliff face. He found bones and pottery dating from 400 BC. But no treasure. The press would have to wait. Allegro had found the locations mentioned in the copper scroll, but its treasures still eluded him. Undaunted, he pushed on to Jerusalem. First, he dug in what he believed was the tomb of Zadok, the priest of Solomon's first temple. He followed the clues in the scroll, and sure enough, he found a tomb. But again, no treasure. But he had one final plan. A few miles away lay the Temple Mount. This is a sacred place to 3 major religions. To Jews, it is the site of the now destroyed temple. To Muslims, it is from where the prophet was taken to heaven. And to Christians, it is the place where Christ was buried, the Holy Sepulchre. Because of its extraordinary religious sensitivity, no one is allowed to dig there. But Allegro was determined to try. Allegro had heard that beneath the dome of the rock, there was a labyrinth of passages and chambers. The scroll mentioned 24 sites within the temple area. Maybe the temple treasure had been hidden underneath where it had once stood. Allegro tried to get permission from the Jordanian Antiquities Office and seemed to be getting somewhere.
He filled in forms for here, forms for there, forms for the next person. He waited and waited.
But at the last minute, the authorities refused.
He could not get permission to go where he really wanted to go, which was to the chambers that were known to exist, a whole system of cisterns and chambers and tunnels underneath the Dome of the Rock.
Despite his friendship with King Hussein, the army denied him access.
The authorities were very reluctant to let anybody interfere with what the Temple Mount, let alone an individual enthusiast like Allegro. Allegro never really had a chance at the Dome of the Rock.
Privately, Allegro suspected the hand of his old nemesis, Roland de Vaux.
He didn't have hard and fast evidence. It was just a suspicion due to the fact that they published some article which sounded as if it was rather rejoicing in the fact that the Allegro expedition hadn't been allowed to go very far, which made him think that they'd had something to do with stopping him.
Allegro was more frustrated than ever.
In Khirbet Mird, Allegro found nothing, and in Jerusalem he also found nothing. That is, of course, he found nothing where he was actually allowed to look.
But for all his despair, Allegro's expeditions had not been a total failure.
They found very little in the way of actual treasure. They found possibilities. They're enough to confirm John's readings of the copper scroll, the places where there were likely to have been deposits laid.
Allegro may not have found any treasure, but he had found the sites listed in the copper scroll. That at least suggested that he was onto something. Not long after, Allegro received news of a breakthrough. A Bedouin friend had found secret caves that might hold the precious temple treasure. Back in Manchester, he went into fundraising mode once more. A year later, he'd raised enough money to return to the desert. His new destination was a place dubbed Christmas Cave, an area that was relatively unexplored.
There had not really been an adequate survey of all the caves in the region, so he thought that he needed to begin somewhere. And Christmas Cave, which is the other side of the Wadi from Qumran, seemed like an excellent place to start.
Allegro now set up camp on the southernmost shores of the Dead Sea. And this time he'd brought a huge and diverse group of adventure seekers.
The hard work would be done by local Arabs, but he also was open-minded enough to take with him some student teachers. He used their enthusiasm to match his own as he set out on his quest.
Joining the archaeologists and surveyors were a dozen female students.
It still was pretty unusual for young women to join expeditions to places where there were absolutely no facilities of any sort. Living in tents, no running water, no water at all except what was found in the pools and the wadis. Absolutely no toilet facilities. But it was a big adventure and they coped extremely well.
Allegro focused on 3 locations: Christmas Cave, a complex in a high cliff accessible only by helicopter; a stone ruin at Mazin, the location of a 1st century BC military base possibly used by Jewish rebels resisting the Romans; and Ein Feshka, with its nearby honeycomb-like warren of caves. Once again, King Hussein lent his support, forcing his government to fast-track excavation licenses, whilst airlifting the equipment into camp. Soon Allegro and his trusted team could set off for Christmas Cave.
They wormed their way inside and it was very dark and full of bats and they didn't think it was going anywhere, but the tunnel went on and on.
The cave had already produced Roman period oil lamps and jugs of silver coins from Byzantine times. Surely there could be more. But weeks of search proved fruitless. The explorations to Mazin and to the caves near Ein Feshka also turned up nothing. Then on Christmas Day, the pressure on Allegro reached a new level. King Hussein visited the camp.
The king took a personal interest in what was going on in this particular expedition and came on Christmas Day to visit the expedition.
Did John Allegro feel under pressure when the king arrived in the helicopter and greeted them all on Christmas Day? I think he should have felt under pressure, and a normal person would have done.
But all Allegro could point to was a few Roman coins and artifacts, dating back to around 70 AD, the time the Romans plundered the Second Temple.
I think as a treasure hunt, it was unsuccessful. As an adventure, it was an extraordinary story.
But for Allegro, adventure was not enough. He had given a decade of his life to unraveling the mysteries of the Copper Scroll. He'd been vilified, his career almost ruined, and he'd taken great risks to search for the hiding place of the ancient treasure. But finally, reluctantly, Allegro called time on his last expedition. He had failed to find any treasure listed in the Copper Scroll. John Marco Allegro died in 1988. He went to the grave almost alone in the belief that the Copper Dead Sea Scroll was authentic. But today, most scholars believe it really is a treasure map, giving directions to real treasures.
His translation work is admirable. He was right. He was right about the fact that the Copper Scroll is a genuine document, and virtually every scholar today accepts that.
John Allegro has been vindicated.
But if it is genuine, where is the treasure?
I suspect that the Romans, who would have known that the temple treasures would have contained some gold and silver, possibly they tortured those they captured and secured some of the items.
And they're not the only ones who might have looted the temple's riches.
It doesn't seem to me unlikely that after 2,000 years of Bedouin roaming around, that the treasure might have been found, but we didn't know about it.
And that sadly is the probable truth. In the intervening 2,000 years, it's very likely everyone's taken their share.
So questions remain, no answers, just more questions.
But there is one other possibility. A small section of the Copper Scroll tells of another scroll, hidden in a tunnel in northern Kolit, containing further secrets of buried temple treasure. But the location of Kolit remains a mystery, and that means that at least some of the treasure could still be out there.